Welcome back to another episode of Count Me In. I'm your host, Adam Larson, and today we have a fantastic guest joining us, Andrew Jamison, CEO and co-founder of Extend, a fintech platform that enables virtual card and spend management capabilities for small businesses. We'll be exploring how small to medium-sized businesses can leverage these innovative solutions to reshape the financial landscape. Andrew will share valuable insights on the importance of embracing fintech technologies and how they can drive efficiency and growth. From the power of data and open APIs to the role of big partners in mitigating risks, Andrew will guide us through the key factors and success stories of implementing fintech solutions. Plus, we'll explore the future of AI and machine learning in finance and the skills finance professionals should cultivate for continued relevance. So let's get started. Andrew, I'm so glad to have you on the Count Me In podcast today. We're excited to have you here. And we're going to be talking about fintech and different solutions, especially in the realm of small to medium-sized businesses. And how do you think, just to jump right in, how do you think that the fintech solutions are reshaping the financial landscape, especially for small to medium-sized businesses? And why is it crucial for them to embrace these technologies?
Look, I think we're continuing down a really exciting journey, actually, where the prevalence of data, right, the ability and accessibility of technology means that we're sort of finding more and more sort of verticalized solutions, right, which helps on two fronts. On the one hand, it means if I'm very specific in the industry that I serve, I start to have a solution that actually talks to me specifically in my industry. And I think that's the ability for people to access that technology means that you now have more and more independent developers who are exploring, right, how these open APIs can be used, leveraged, and really brought together to create solutions that are increasingly targeted at the different functions that we work in. So I think that crossroad is we're there, and it's only going to explode from here in my mind.
It's definitely going to explode. You see the different technology is getting more and more accessible, but sometimes it's harder when you're in a small, medium-sized business. Sometimes you're an accounting department of one or two or three people, and it's harder to implement some different types of technology. What advice would you give to somebody trying to look into saying, hey, I want to jump into this, but I may not have the budget that bigger organizations have?
Look, I think when I look at small companies, they want to do more with what they have. Right. And they're trying to abstract away the complexity because you're right. I look at our team, right? We're a team of 80 odd employees. And the reality is I have one VP of finance and he's only just now gotten hired his right-hand person. And the reality is that they're jacks of all trade, right? They're AP, they're essentially all your cash flow management, and they do all your reporting all in one. So if I sit down specifically with him, it's really all about seeing how they can leverage existing software for longer. How do you abstract away some of the challenges with some of the software that you might have as you start growing as a business? Mm-hmm. How do you leverage other solutions which are just embedded with those solutions so that you don't have to go through a massive transformation? Right? I'll give you a great example, and that's Graham Stanton at Advise. Right? His whole thesis is all about lots of businesses use QuickBooks and then quickly you grow up if you're a successful company, but do you really want to make the next step to the next enterprise solution, which actually costs a disproportionate amount of money more relative to the benefits that you're going to get from them in the early years. So I think there's always that healthy tension, but I think we're starting to see more and more people focus on the abstraction piece, keep the ledger the way it is, and then just start adding solutions over the top that help me run my business more efficiently.
I like that. Adapt it to what works for you as opposed to maybe in doing a whole ERP system that may be too much money or too much of a spend for you.
Yeah. And I think, again, finance team of one, I came out of the exact polar opposite world, right? The first 10 years of my career were in deploying SAP, right? So right at the sort of enterprise resource planning side of the equation. And just a completely different beast, right? In terms of the different types of people that you had to go and engage with, and also just the number of departments that you got to engage with. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the resources that were required just to keep the engine running for that platform were just completely different.
Now, we can't talk about moving to AI different technologies without talking about things like fraud and just the risk there. And especially if you're a smaller department of one, like in your case, there's two people, how do you protect against hackers or different things, different emerging threats, especially in the fraud space, especially if you're a medium-sized business?
Look, I think you have to rely on the bigger partners, right? You can work certainly to continue to enhance the solution, but you do have to lean on some of the bigger partners, right? We lean on certainly on the AWS infrastructure to help us there because they have so much more money to plow into this. Now, obviously they're a bigger target than we are, but they also have way more resources to help plug those gaps. So in our mind, it's also two things. One is it's not really about if, it's when, right? The likely it's going to happen. And then it's really about how do you mitigate it, right? In terms of relying on these partners. Now, clearly cybersecurity, what's to do with encryption or authentication, I think that a lot of work continues to be done there. And I think we all experience it in the consumer world, which is more and more of it has to be done through biometrics, or has to be done with MFA, and sometimes has to be done through both. And I think we need to continue and go down that path. And I think that's not going to change either. I think that's where more and more resources are going to get plowed in, especially if you're in the fintech space, right? We're dealing with money, right? We're dealing with the lifeblood of companies. And I think as a result of it, we have to be doubly sure to make sure that those threats are mitigated as best we can.
So, you've already talked about having threats and relying on third parties. Are there any other key features that these types of businesses should look for when then looking into different solutions?
The one thing I've learned is one size doesn't fit all, right? You have to look at, what is the primary tool that people are using? Is it mobile, in which case you have access to certain tools, right? Is it web, in which case you have access to different tools? And you have to marry them all together as well and to sort of create one overall solution. So for me, it's also having the ability to look at things through those different lenses. And again, when I look at our business, right, where we are helping to promote, right, existing credit cards in circulation through partners like American Express or Regions Bank or Pacific West Bank, where we're promoting people can use their existing credit card. And there is an underlying piece that comes with that, which is I specifically want to leverage the infrastructure of these big bank players without having to repeat it and replicate it for ourselves. Why? Because they have way more data points than we could ever hope to have. And really that's why leveraging that infrastructure on the back end creates an additional layer of security.
It really does create that extra layer of security because you're relying on people who may have the bigger infrastructure to build in those things that you might be able to build yourself as not a bigger company.
I think there's two parts, right? It's like everyone can go out and build anything. Mm-hmm. And what I've learned through my time, right, with big companies like the 12 years I was at American Express, you can always start a project. The real thing, is it really the core of your business? And if it isn't, you have to ask yourself that difficult question of, yes, I can build the best mousetrap for today and maybe tomorrow, but what about the day after that and the month after that and the year after that? Because we know how budgets operate in these companies. It's essentially every year you go back with a cap in hand and you try and secure a budget. And then, essentially you go into some sort of a recession or some sort of a cutback and this budget gets constrained and suddenly you're no longer investing in that piece of business. And it's amazing how quickly you fall off being best in class if you don't invest in solutions today. Mm-hmm. I think that's the other thing to be really wary of is you have to be mindful that to double down on areas that you are truly going to commit to as a business, because otherwise you're going to go through these cycles. And I think that's where maybe large companies today are placing more emphasis on their partnerships with fintechs. They're embracing fintech because I think they've realized that trying to compete in that world sometimes isn't good for them either. Distracts them from their core. They don't move as quick as they would want to move. And they certainly can't experiment as quick as they would want to because they have all these different layers of approvals. And then the bigger challenge still is not just about the layers of approvals. It's the fact you start spreading across lines of business that maybe don't have experience in that particular segment. And so you make mistakes in thinking that consumers work maybe the same way as large corporate. And you're not actually sort of, again, identifying the right solution for that particular client segment that you're trying to serve.
Yeah. So we know that implementing these applications and partnering with different companies ultimately saves you money. It might not save it right up front. There's a little bit of investment involved, but over time, it'll definitely save you money. Are there any like real world success stories or examples that you can share of where people have implemented this and really seen a huge change?
Look, I mean, that's part of the journey that we're on, right? Which is we deal with a lot of finance teams, and the word we keep hearing, day after day, month after month, is this wonderful word called reconciliation. And that's what eats time, right? It essentially you have approved something somewhere down the line, either verbally or through a technology system. And then you have to marry it up with a payment, right? And so that aspect of things, we talk to a lot of clients who used to have all these charges appear on one central bill product. And so at the end of the month, they'd have this huge list of transactions and they'd be like, right, now I've got to allocate them. And the reality is this was happening over weekends. So it's almost like, great, you've given me my life back, right? Which is, if you're automating hundreds and hundreds of these transactions back to these digital records that happen upstream, then truly, not only are you creating efficiencies and allowing people to do more with the time that they have, I think you're also taking away some pretty mundane tasks.
Yeah.
And I think that to me is the key. And I think there's obviously a lot being discussed around AI and all this thing. And I'm like, AI is not new. It's been around for decades. It's just got a new name. And for me, it's more about the application of that information in such a way that we'll see, I think the lowest hanging fruit and the earliest benefits will really come in that automation of back office functions, right? Things, frankly, that don't need or warrant, right, a person to be doing and can be done just as well and sometimes better by a machine. And I think that's where I get excited is like, imagine if you can get away from really 30, 40, 50% of tasks that are super mundane and not strategic. And let's focus on some more interesting problems so that essentially we can really move the needle forwards, because there's a lot of green pasture out there, things that need to be moved forwards for businesses. And so it'd be much more fun to spend our time tackling those challenges than some of these mundane tasks that these different teams and functions have to perform either on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis.
Yeah, it seems the rise of machine learning and AI. I mean, like you said, it's been around for years. It's definitely coming to everybody's worldview with the ChatGPT and generative AI kind of things. With those things coming to a head and really changing how the finance team looks, what are skills and things that people can do? Maybe the people who are running those tasks, like say you're listening to this podcast and you're one of those people doing those mundane tasks you were talking about. What can they start doing right now to make sure that they're relevant as they go forward in the future?
Look, I think it's all about having an inquisitive mind, right? And it's all about what's the next challenge you're trying to solve for. And I think you always sort of try and pick out these needles in a haystack, and the machines will do that, right? Do I see these same transactions happening twice? And I have to write a report. I can just ask the machine and it essentially starts returning these things. And I think those are things that become really meaningful to businesses, is help me pick those needles out of the haystack. That in the past, I would have had to go and write some report to go and pull back. And guess what? Writing a report takes resources. All of a sudden it's like, well, I can't do that either because those resources are allocated to something else. So if you can essentially, right, that's the beauty of a conversational AI is, yes, of course it has to be programmed.
Yeah.
The reality is it continues to learn and evolve, and you can fine tune it. And then you can adapt it to different scenarios. And so you can start asking different questions of the machine. And it, again, continues to improve over time. And I think we've already seen with chatbots that servicing is increasingly coming through machines, except we all know dead end pretty quickly even today. And that's almost more frustrating, at which point you sort of pick up the phone and rage and say, I want to speak to a human being. And then depending on who the company is, either easier or harder to get hold of an individual.
Yeah.
But I think that's where it's going to help, right? Is help me service myself. Because that's another big thing, right? Even as a department, when you hit these different challenges, it's all about, I want to be able to service this myself. And I think that's really the key. And I think that's where fintechs have also helped a lot, right? Which is help me unearth things which are just not in an obvious place. And so we spend a lot of time as essentially we have digital credit cards flowing through the ecosystem. The beauty really of these digital credit cards is you actually append them with metadata along the journey, which is what department someone in. Then you start figuring out what business unit they're in, or you start to figure out what's the expense category, and all these things can be automated, right? When you start pulling together different things. And I think then it's going to become even more interesting as we go down the line, because you're really going to be able to pull together these different data points to get insights around what's really happening with the health of the business. And I think that's why I also like this marrying up of old and new, because that also means you don't have to go and rebuild everything. There's access to these data points and huge piece of information that you get through the existing banks. And now it's about, great, I can use that information and I can enhance that information and I can then send it back to the corporate who can now update their ledgers directly. And a lot of this manipulation was made available to the Fortune 500, Fortune 1000. There were big projects that they had to go and pay for, mind you. But the reality is now more of this is becoming accessible to small businesses. And I think that level of automation and insights is really going to help them move forward.
It really is, because I mean, you go back in the day where you had to categorize, have a category for each transaction, and make sure you do those things if like people use the QuickBooks in the back in the day. But having, like you said, the embedded metadata, being able to have that automatically, you can automatically start tracking those things, and it allows you to move faster and analyze better. And as in leaders in the organizations, they have to rethink how they're leading their team, because you're no longer looking at the little mundane tasks, but you're able to do those more strategic decisions, like you were saying.
And also like the idea of more real-time data flowing in.
Yeah.
And I think that's, if I'm a finance person, that's what I want, is real-time transactional information and data. So I know what's coming down the pike, or essentially, how I'm trying to manage the existing cost base, right? And I certainly was in a company when we grew really fast, but we were sort of on a route to doing an IPO. And I remember very distinctly the CFO saying, the hardest thing to control is all these incidental expenses that keep rolling through. So again, how do you sort of manage, how do you pull the different levers as a finance person to make sure that people have the right tools in their hands so they can go and spend when they need to spend, but actually it's been approved ahead of time, right? And not only is it approved ahead of time for a very specific thing, but it's actually got all the metadata that says once it happens, right, the chapter's closed.
Yeah.
No need to revisit, right? It's essentially flowed all the way through. And that, to me, is what finance folks are really looking for, is give me the chance to opine on something ahead of time, and let's work together to make sure that it has all the information needed so that it then flows through the system and we just look at it once.
Yeah. And if you just watch TV, you see commercials for these things just to consumers, like, hey, sign for this app and it'll tell you all your bills and you can clean up your stuff. If we're making it available for consumers, that means small to medium-sized businesses are going to have better access to these types of softwares.
Yeah, look at so sort of the coming together of sort of finance and procurement, right? And things like Glean, right, are out there.
Yeah.
Also really helping, as solutions, really sort of focus in on what you're buying. Is it competitive? And all of those different things come into play. And I think that becomes also great tools for all about providing insights to these small finance departments and really help them to operate at a much higher level than they were operating beforehand.
Yeah. So as we look toward the future, where do you think we're going? Where are the new technologies going to hit, and how are things going to improve as we look 5 to 10 years in the future?
So look, I take a lot of learnings from my days, certainly at SAP. And that's to say that when you really look at it and the amount of effort I feel they put into HANA and to all these different things, it's all about data, right? And so their primary concern, I'm guessing here, was we just need to be the source of data, the ledger, the source of truth, and we'll facilitate other things, right? And what started off as EDI is now APIs.
Yeah.
And then we're going to layer on top of that, right, some of these more sort of conversational components of it. But I think what I'm learning through that and what I'm taking away from that is there isn't a huge appetite for companies to move from one ledger to the next. And that's partly because the ledger's the ledger. Now, obviously, it can be done in real time. It helps. But the reality is, it's really what you do with that data there and then.
Yeah.
And I like the idea that a lot of these legacy players, and it's financial service obviously is one of those players. It has a lot of legacy infrastructure in there. Is really going to get updated really fast and integrated and embedded faster into the software solutions that finance people are using or procurement people are using, because essentially they're going to focus on that last mile. And we're not really there yet, right? I think when it comes to data, a lot of work has happened with companies pulling data out of ERPs. But obviously the really hard bit is pushing data into ERPs. Why? Because if I'm a finance person, I want to see those things before you go and update my ledgers. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that particular front, right? In terms of great, pull data. And again, commercially, people have pulled data. Why? Because it helped with underwriting.
Yeah.
But then we've learned that underwriting is really, really actually quite tough as well, right? You look at some of the decisions that some of the emerging credit card in the commercial space made around no longer supporting, right, small business. Why? Because in an economic downturn, the reality is it's small business that suffers, and that's where losses are suffered. And so some people made the decision to walk away from there. Now, the interesting thing is that's where banks have played for years. And that's where they've learned. And they have other sources of information and data to go and support, right, businesses. The regular mom and pop businesses are out there, because not everything is about fintech, right? There's the real world too. And America runs on small business and middle market and Dunkin' Donuts apparently, but that's a different thing. But that's kind of in my mind, right, where things are going to get really much more interesting is really helping to deliver on the promise to facilitate the world of the office of the CFO in these smaller companies, where essentially there's more control, but the integration is better in terms of flowing data and information into the systems and the systems that have been put over the top of them to make sure that they don't lose that metadata and they can report on that metadata or use it for conversational AI, et cetera, et cetera.
Definitely. Well, Andrew, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. This has been a really insightful conversation. And thanks so much for sharing your insights with our audience today.
No, absolutely, Adam. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Enjoyed the conversation.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.